Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. On this episode of Writers at Work, I want to pay tribute to a man who is high on the short list of the best writers in the history of the TV medium. He is Rod Serling, and this week marks the centennial of his birth. Born on Christmas Day in Syracuse, New York, Serling is best known to TV fans of many generations for the following program.
You unlock this door with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension, a dimension of sound, a dimension of sight, a dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both shadow and substance, of things and ideas. You've just crossed over into the Twilight Zone.
By the way, you've heard that introductions to seasons 4 and 5 of The Twilight Zone 1,000 times, haven't you? Notice the writerly touches, the use of language to seduce and connect. The first word, you, provides instant engagement. Then there is the repeated use of the word dimension in staccato rhythm. Then the poetic and mysterious, a land of shadow and substance, of things and ideas. Then again, the word you've just crossed over into the Twilight Zone. 48 words, not an ounce of fat, on a dare I couldn't say it better. Rod Serling wrote the teleplays for 92 of the 156 episodes of The Twilight Zone, a series he created in 1959 and fought to control. He served as host for all 156 of those episodes, appearing on camera beginning with season 2. I've been unable to confirm this, but I'm fairly certain Serling wrote the intros and outros to each episode. They heighten and extend the impact of the story. Consider his closing remarks for Walking Distance, an extraordinary episode in which a discontented man finds he's traveled back in time to his childhood.
Martin Sloan, age 36, vice president in charge of media. Successful in most things, but not in the one effort that all men try at some time in their lives, trying to go home again. And also, like all men, perhaps there'll be an occasion, maybe a summer night sometime, when he'll look up from what he's doing and listen to the distant music of a calliope, and hear the voices and the laughter of the people and the places of his past. And perhaps across his mind there'll flit a little errant wish that a man might not have to become old, never outgrow the parks and the merry-go-rounds of his youth. And he'll smile then, too, because he'll know it is just an errant wish, some wisp of memory not too important, really, some laughing ghosts that cross a man's mind, that are a part of the Twilight Zone.
For The Twilight Zone, Serling wrote comedy, adventure, suspense, and of course sci-fi. He indulged his interests, aviation, lowbrow sports, and, having seen combat in the Pacific during World War II, life during wartime. He was a sentimentalist who wrote with great yearning for better days, reflecting on his childhood in Binghamton, New York, and life prior to the pressures of his profession. Perhaps most notably, he wrote, often with great indignation and no small application of loathing, about world affairs. Serling had no tolerance for fascists, dictators, racists, censors, bullies, and political weasels of any stripe. He was as effective an anti-communist as there was in media at the time, scoring points without resorting to the kind of tactics he despised in others. A 2-time winner of the Emmy for Outstanding Writing Achievement in Drama for The Twilight Zone, Serling understood the medium and let his story and his characters speak. In The Obsolete Man, a librarian played by Burgess Meredith is ruled unnecessary in an authoritarian society. Serling frames the tale, his words dripping with disgust.
Wordsworth, Romney, obsolescence.
You walk into this room at your own risk, because it leads to the future. Not a future that will be, but one that might be. This is not a new world. It is simply an extension of what began in the old one. It has patterned itself after every dictator who has ever planted the ripping imprint of a boot on the pages of history since the beginning of time. It has refinements, technological advances, and a more sophisticated approach to the destruction of human freedom. But like every one of the superstates that preceded it, it has one iron rule. Logic is an enemy and truth is a menace.
Serling championed the downtrodden, the alienated, and the alone. Desire is just out of reach. Loss is irreversible. Conformity is death. Serling had a bedrock belief in what matters most. As he wrote in his outro to In Praise of Pip, the ties of flesh are deep and strong. The capacity to love is a vital, rich, and all-consuming function of the human animal. You can find nobility and sacrifice and love wherever you may seek it out, down the block, in the heart, or in the Twilight Zone. It's not a very courageous position to state that the Twilight Zone is among the greatest of all TV series. In its inaugural season, Variety called it the best that has ever been accomplished in half-hour film television. Years later, the Writers Guild of America stated, "No show in the history of television has lingered in the imagination quite like Rod Serling's anthology series, which could function both as science fiction chiller and issue-driven examination of human behavior." In 2024, a Boston Globe TV critic wrote, "The Twilight Zone is still TV's most influential series 6 decades after it ended." The Twilight Zone is readily available via several streaming services, and the Sci-Fi Channel runs a Twilight Zone marathon at least once a year. Devoted fans can quote a single phrase to invoke a memory of an entire episode. Willoughby, it's a cookbook. Wish him into the cornfield. My name is Talking Tina, and I am going to kill you. And so on. People who love the Twilight Zone won't hesitate to tell you so. I once interviewed Tom Waits over lunch in a Chinese restaurant in Petaluma, California. He spent a good chunk of the interview describing in detail a Twilight Zone episode in which a poor man is tricked into buying dust said to contain magical powers. By the way, Rod Serling wrote that episode. The thing of it is, though, is that for all the praise one bestows upon him for the Twilight Zone, Rod Serling was already established as a writer before the series began. After bouncing around a bit after the Army, Serling was hired by a radio station in Cincinnati that led him to writing for programs syndicated across the U.S. He found the work grueling, saying, "The minute you tie yourself down to a radio or TV station, you write around the clock. You rip out ideas, many of them irreplaceable. They go on and consistently can never go on again, and you've sold them for $50 a week." But the job taught Serling to write tight copy on a deadline. It created a model for how he would work in the years ahead. Serling moved over to TV in Cincinnati as a writer. He acquired an agent and freelanced while still doing his day job. In 1952, he decided to freelance full-time. Relocating to Connecticut and then New York City, he wrote for TV anthology programs like Kraft Television Theater. In 1955, Kraft broadcast a Serling work entitled Patterns, a hard-hitting and bitter tale of corporate intrigue. It was an instant hit. A New York Times critic called it one of the high points in the TV medium's evolution and a creative triumph. Serling then adapted his teleplay for Hollywood. Released in 1956, Patterns stars Van Heflin, Everett Sloane, and Ed Begley.
Few mistakes in business and few mistakes in judging men.
Well, you've made one this time. This report...
I refuse to engage in a running fight because a supposedly responsible official of this company persists in wasting time haggling over credit.
That is not fair. I was not haggling over credit. This is a joint report that we worked on.
Don't presume to tell me what's true and what is not true. What am I, some kind of idiot that I can't recognize another man's thinking? Whatever your abilities in the past, Mr. Briggs, your work hasn't shown this stamp of originality and talent in 10 years. A man slips, clutches, he loses his grip, he tries to hang on by someone else's.
You have no right to say that. Bill, will you please speak up?
Do, by all means, Mr. Briggs.
Later that year, Serling wrote for Playhouse 90 a story set in the world of boxing entitled Requiem for a Heavyweight. He won an Emmy and a Peabody Award for his script. Much as he had done with Patterns, he adapted the story for film. Starring Anthony Quinn, Jackie Gleason, and Mickey Rooney, it's a dark, hopeless, and heartbreaking drama populated with unsavory, unforgettable characters. His career blossoming, Serling moved to California, but struggled to get his stories made as he wanted. Sponsors who funded TV broadcast nitpicked his scripts. His teleplay, Noon on Doomsday, about the lynching in the American South of a Jewish pawnbroker, was inspired by the murder of Emmett Till, but was significantly altered before broadcast. He revisited the Till story for Playhouse 90 production, entitled A Town Has Turned to Dust, but again, alterations were made. The victim, no longer black, but Mexican. The location moved elsewhere. Reviewers praised Serling and director John Frankenheimer for taking on the topic of racial bigotry, but Serling knew the story he wanted told wasn't. He decided to create his own program. In a 1959 interview with Mike Wallace, who introduced him as having few peers in TV drama, Serling said he'd had enough.
I don't want to fight anymore. I don't want to I don't want to have to battle sponsors and agencies. I don't want to have to push for something that I want and have to settle for second best. I don't want to have to compromise all the time, which in essence is what the television writer does if he wants to put on controversial themes.
Well, then why do you stay in television?
I stay in television because I think it's very possible to perform a function of providing adult, meaningful, exciting, challenging drama without dealing in controversy necessarily. This, of course, Mike, is not the best of all possible worlds. I am not suggesting that this is at the absolute millennium. I think it's criminal that we're not permitted to make dramatic note of social evils as they exist, of controversial themes as they are inherent in our society. I think it's ridiculous that drama, which by its very nature should make a comment on those things that affect our daily lives, is in the position, at least in terms of television drama, of not being able to take this stand.
You'll note, though, that Serling is deliberately misleading in his statement. He already knew The Twilight Zone, which had been acquired by CBS, would take on controversial subjects. But he would do so in the guise of fantasy, of sci-fi. He knew, by experience and intuitively, that he could write stories that were entertaining, and if the program was a hit, he would have the latitude he wanted. Serling already had an inkling that his idea would play. The pilot he wrote for The Twilight Zone was steered by CBS to the Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse and broadcast as The Time Element, starring William Bendix and Martin Balsam. It involves a man who dreams about a forthcoming attack on Pearl Harbor.
Once upon a time, there was a psychiatrist named Arnold Gillespie and a patient whose name was Peter Jensen. Mr. Jensen walked into the office 9 minutes ago. It is 11 o'clock, Saturday morning, October 4th, 1958. It is perhaps chronologically trite to be so specific about an hour and the date, but involved in this story is a time element.
Though it was never broadcast under the Twilight Zone banner, it may be considered at least a precursor to the series, if not its model. By the way, you can find the time element on YouTube in a fairly pristine print. Canceled by CBS, The Twilight Zone ended its run in 1964, its final original episode appearing on June 19th of that year. It limped to its conclusion, with several substandard episodes following a gem written by Serling, in which a sadistic authoritarian apparatchik toys with a defector, played by Martin Landau, who outwits him. Serling next created The Loner, a Western series starring Lloyd Bridges. Here's how Serling pitched The Loner to potential sponsors.
Our new project, The Loner, will be a series of probing, human, believable stories based on the experiences of one man, William Colton. Colton is an ex-Union cavalry officer who heads west following the Civil War.
Here, Serling delivered as promised. The Loner is probing and human, and thus somewhat less action-oriented than most Westerns of the era. It's contemplative, leaning on character studies in the post-Civil War years. Though Serling wrote 15 of the 26 episodes, viewers rejected The Loner, and it was canceled after one season. You can find most episodes on YouTube. See if you agree that it's much better than the quick hook by CBS suggests. Serling reemerged 5 years later with Night Gallery, an anthology series he created and also served as on-air host. Unlike The Twilight Zone, Night Gallery leaned toward the supernatural and occasional horror, without much room for social commentary. Clearly, the network did not want The Twilight Zone Part 2. Serling wrote the first 3 pilot episodes, including Eyes, directed by a 23-year-old Steven Spielberg and starring Joan Crawford. For its first full season, Serling wrote 11 episodes. One was their tearing down Tim Riley's bar, in which a lonely widower at the end of a business career recalls happier times. It was nominated for an Emmy. But Serling began to withdraw from Night Gallery in its second season. Of the 61 episodes, there were 2 or 3 per hour-long program, he wrote just 10 original ones. In the third and final season, he contributed just 2 original screenplays. He had become increasingly displeased with the program, stating so publicly, as the producers tinkered with the format, replacing his introduction on occasion with brief comedy sketches. Several original teleplays and adaptations by Serling were rejected by the producer, one of which, The View of Whatever, in which a man travels to Serling's beloved Binghamton, New York in the 1930s, seems drawn from the same well as The Twilight Zone's Walking Distance. I'd love to see it. Looking back, we see Rod Serling measured against an impossible standard, perhaps the greatest TV series up to that point. The quality of his writing for The Loner and Night Gallery on occasion matches some, and perhaps more than some, of his work for The Twilight Zone when viewed in isolation, that is, without concern of how his work was directed or presented by a network. His stories satisfy and intrigue, whether in half-hour or hour-long format. Comparisons to The Twilight Zone short sell his career. Remember, in addition to Patterns and Requiem for a Heavyweight, he wrote the screenplay for 7 Days in May, a 1964 military thriller starring Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas. That film, like so many of his stories for The Twilight Zone, addresses many issues that still plague us today, some 6 decades later. Serling adapted Irving Wallace's The Man, the story of the first black president. That film premiered in 1972. It's often overlooked, but Rod Serling co-wrote the screenplay for Planet of the Apes. Serling died during open-heart surgery in 1975 at age 50. Given that I was raised on his writing and have, as you can tell, outsized admiration for his early work and The Twilight Zone, I have no way to gauge how he's viewed by people decades younger than I am. I suspect he's part of the cultural wallpaper, a black and white figure, cigarette in hand, who intones lines like, "You're traveling through another dimension," and "submitted for your approval." But I'll note that even when the character of Rod Serling, the narrator, is caricatured, Serling is never stripped of his dignity. Clearly, he remains a formidable presence, a man of merit, a significant talent. As an author and journalist, I'm not so much interested in his public persona as I am in his body of work, much as I am not so much interested in the Beatles as public figures than as the greatest rock group ever to enter a recording studio. For me, my bias is informed by my love of his work and my knowledge of just how great it was and remains. As we mark his centennial, let's do so thusly. Rod Serling helped develop television into an extraordinary vehicle for storytelling. He was the greatest TV screenwriter of his time. With his writing, he fought against bigotry, narrow-mindedness, conventionality, and intimidation. He believed in home and hope and love. And to this day, 100 years after his birth, he remains a giant in the entertainment industry, a man who fought to tell his stories as he wanted to, and in doing so, influenced our lives. Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.